Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today's eClaims webinar. My name is Anthony Contenzo. I'm a program manager in the eClaims unit. And joining me today is Mike Hunter, who is also a program manager in the eClaims unit, as well as Mary Duncan, who is from the monitoring unit. For today's agenda, we'll first be going over new edits that became effective a few days ago, as well as edits that will be becoming effective as of June 15th. We'll also be going over some coding changes made to an O2 transaction processing document, and that became effective on March 16th as well. Monitoring unit will then take over the portion of this presentation to go over recurring suspension issues and reminders that they would like to be made aware of. And then we'll be going over the most frequent errors, the most frequent errors, the top 3 errors returned during the past 90 days. And then at the end of the webinar, when we have any time left, we will be going over any questions you may have submitted. And as a reminder, please use the chat feature and send it to the presenters, the panelists, basically. And it might also be labeled as Q&A, as WebEx did make a recent update to their system. So now I'm going to pass it over to Mike so he can go over the latest reminders.
Thank you, Tony. As Tony mentioned, we have implemented a few new edits, some of those necessitated by IIBC changes, as well as some that we are just implementing at the same time. These were all posted on our changelog last September 15th, 2022, and they were implemented just a couple days ago. For those not familiar, the IIBC now has a gender code of X, non-binary, and T, self-reported transgender values. Those are for employee gender code. For that, New York is accepting X, non-binary. We chose to not accept the T code as of now. But again, we are accepting X, non-binary as of March 16th. Also, for several DNs, as you can see on the screen, we now have a new error code in place for an amount. This was necessitated because of negative values that we had seen. We were actually seeing folks putting negative values in money fields. There was already an existing DP rule for this, so we just implemented that rule. So we will no longer accept negative values in the monetary fields. We will accept anything greater than or equal to 0 as the error text notes there. For dependent gender code, similar to employee gender code, we added, and in this case, grayed out X and T. We don't actually accept dependent gender code in this scenario. Also implemented and will be was published on December 15th and will be implemented on June 15th per the 6 months notice. We are implementing the new change to the DP rule per IRR CLM 926. This was necessitated because we were seeing double quotes and other data that would not be appropriate for city fields. So as a result of that IRR, we will now reject, unless it's one of the acceptable characters, the new population restriction for these fields. Specifically states may only include a hyphen, apostrophe, period, or multiple words if contained in the city name. Cities with a numerical name must be spelled out. That's per the DP rule. If you do submit something after June 15th, and for example, use a comma or a double quote, would be rejected by us. Also just wanted to include a reminder, we went over this in January, but felt it important to go over again, just regarding timely FROI filings. Claim administration ensured timely filings of FROIs so that we're properly notified that you are the claim administrator. This also helps you avoid penalties from the board's monitoring unit. And it also gives us information for the routing of the prior authorization requests and to make sure that they're routed to the correct claim administrator. We have recently begun to actually identify cases with PARs that have missing FROIs. Unfortunately, we are seeing quite a few. What we're going to do, rather than send one email at a time to claim administrators, because some do have quite a few that are missing, we're going to be increasing our outreach efforts to the trading partner business and administrator contacts. If you owe a FROI and have never filed one, if you owe a FROI 02 to update the insurer, or if you're the new TPA and owe a FROI AQ or AU, what we're going to do is you're probably going to get an email from us with a group of list of cases that you owe on. We do ask that you act on those. For right now, the system's flagging those, and we're able to move them to you. But obviously, the goal is to get you to file that FROI so the system can automatically route them, and it speeds up the process for both you, the injured worker, as well as the board. With that, we'll go over some coding changes made to the transaction processing documents. So as we say in every webinar, we do encourage feedback from trading partners, and actually this is something that came directly from your feedback. So some of the FTP filers have brought to our attention that we were rejecting some change 02 transactions improperly. The IAIBC's assumptions indicate that any data element that is marked as X or NA can be populated if desired, but cannot be edited by the jurisdiction. Since we are not editing, we are ignoring that data populating those fields. If there's not a maintenance type code accepted where that data element had a severity ranking other than X or NA, we would reject that change 02 transaction. Also, we were only looking at accepted FROI MTCs if the transaction was a FROI 02, or accepted SHROI MTCs if the transaction was a SHROI 02. So what we did was we modified the change 02 processing, and it was implemented on March 16th, so just a little while ago, to recognize data for both the FROI and SHROI for the latest accepted value. That way, it's not looking distinctly at a FROI for a FROI 02 or a SHROI for a SHROI 02. So we are looking at both of those now related to whether there was something other than a severity ranking other than X or NA. There are 11 data elements that we will accept when an 02 is received for any of those data elements, even if the only accepted MTC had a severity ranking of X or NA. Those are on the screen here. Again, it's a conclusion of the presentation. Once it's posted to the website, we will be sending our normal notification that the presentation's posted, so you'll have a copy of that list. We will be modifying the actual reference document we have posted on the website just to update it to match what we are doing. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Mary Duncan from the monitoring unit for the suspension portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. As most of you are aware, it's been almost 2 years since we began assessing penalties for the late submission of the SHROI showing suspension, and we would like to identify a couple of reoccurring issues that we see. Since we are only focusing on the filings today, we would ask that if you have any questions regarding penalties associated with these filings, to please email monitoring@wcb.ny.gov. One of the issues that we see a lot of is when the SHROI EP is being filed showing that the employer is paying wages, and is followed by a suspension once the claimant returns to work. Later, awards are being made to reimburse the employer. We are seeing that the filing to show reimbursement is the Troy IP followed by a suspension. Although this is not wrong, we would expect to see the PY filed showing reimbursement to the employer, as this does not require a subsequent suspension filing. By filing the IP and a suspension, the suspension is being measured again for timeliness and most likely will incur a penalty. The other reoccurring issue we see is receiving objections that a suspension is not due when the employer continues wages and the claimant returns to work. We would like to reiterate that in addition to the requirements set out by WCL 25-1D and under 12 NYC RR 300.22, a suspension filing is also due when an injured claimant is paid wages in lieu of compensation. So basically it means if the employer continues to pay the wages to the injured claimant in lieu of compensation, they are required to file a suspension within 16 days when the claimant returns to work. Just a couple of reminders about when a suspension is due. Regardless if the lost time is compensable or not, if you make a filing showing payment, you must file a suspension showing payments have stopped. When a payment of indemnity has been made and later that payment is voided or stopped, a suspension is still required, and you can use the reporting recovery code of 880, which is voided indemnity benefit check recovery, and this can also be reported on MTCs such as the CA, CB, RB, and ER. Again, if you have any questions, you can email monitoring@wcb.ny.gov, and these would be questions related to penalties. As far as filings, which is what filings are proper, you would need to email eClaims. I'm going to pass it back to Tony.
Thank you, Mary. So now we're going to go over the most frequent errors returned during the past 90 days, the top 3 errors. And the most common error that we saw, as well as the top error for 2022, was actually a carryover edit from eClaims version 3.0, and that's population restriction 0085064A. Now, this population restriction is intended to prevent a new benefit type code from being introduced as a sweep benefit if it was not previously submitted as an event benefit or on a SHROI URG or /SA. And this was based on the IIBC Claims EDI Section 4 rules. The next most common error that we saw is population restriction 0016-117. And this is in regard to match data rules that does not allow more than one match data element to be changed at a time on an O2 transaction. And the third most common error that we found within the past 90 days is also an eClaims 3.0 carryover. And that's ensuring that the agreement to compensate code is sent with liability after the board has issued a notice that the case has been established with an ANCR or an ODNCR finding in accordance with Section 21A. And in regard to all of these population restrictions that you saw, we remind the FTP filers to ensure that the systems that you utilize to submit this data are programmed accordingly to avoid any further rejections coming down. And with that, we're actually at our questions portion of the presentation. If you would please use the Q&A option that you have available to you and send it to the panelists. We're going to be taking a look at them now, and we'll get back on within a brief moment of silence or two, and we'll get back to you shortly. Thank you.
There's a question regarding timelines for penalties. Any of those questions, if you can email to monitoring@wcb.ny.gov. Since there's specific timelines you quoted, they will be best to answer that in writing for you. Next question is to confirm if an initial payment is issued, a Troy IP is filed, but then the payment's voided, a Troy FX would be required with recovery code 880 included. Yes, that is correct. That voided code is just to show us that you voided the checks and also suspended payments to that claimant. Are the slides going to be shared? Yes. Once the presentation is posted to the website, we send an email blast out to all the administrator, business, and technical contacts that we maintain, and you'll be notified that it's available on the website. Next question is, can you report a non-matched data change on an O2 that also reports a change to a matched data field? Yes. It's just the limitation is just to match data fields themselves. There's a question about the last slide and whether it was with liability or without. In that case, it was mentioning with liability. The specific exclusion is just if we issue a decision establishing ANCR or it's a year from the payments, we wouldn't allow you to use without liability any further. So it is in regards to without liability, but it's an actual edit in there that restricts when you can actually use it after that ANCR or 1 year. We're going to look, we have a couple more questions that came in, so bear with us. We're just going to look at those and try to answer some more questions. Next question is, when an employer's knowledge of date of disability falls after a claimant's return to work date and more than 7 days are missed, would it be correct to use the date employer had knowledge of disability as the suspension effective date?
For the measurements for the timely suspension, the date the employer had knowledge of the disability is not used. So if you could email your question to monitoring, and we will give you the specific measurements that are used and what dates you should be using on your suspension filings.
There's a question regarding penalties and whether they are waived if a Troy IP and SX are sent in error instead of the PY for that employer reimbursement scenario.
We would ask that if you do receive a penalty in that scenario, to please submit a request for review through the payer compliance application. We will review it and make a determination based on what you are telling us and what is in the case file.
The next question is regarding occupational disease and when a judge establishes a case. When the judge establishes a date of disablement, they should be establishing a full date of disablement, whether it's January 1st of 2013, but they typically would establish, if there's specific scenarios and questions, you can always email the eClaims mailbox. Next question is, when a modification of prior awards is created with a notice of decision, is it necessary to create multiple CAs for each rate change or just update to the current rate? Typically, the cleanest way would be each of those rate changes so that you do document that you've paid each of those. It's clear both for obviously the parties as well as if monitoring was to look at that case. If you did report just the most recent, just realize that if someone's looking at that, they may be looking for a payment register later just to verify your payments. Next one is, can you go over the EP suspension filing and what MTC code is required? So in 3.1, it is the Troy SX suspension. Within that, there's what's called the full suspension reason code. So it would depend on the reason for the suspension. In the case of claimant returning to work, to use that as an example, it would be the suspension code of S1 for claimant returning to work. Next question is, if we submit a Troy PY for insured reimbursement, we don't have to report the IEP. That is correct. From Mary's example, you have already filed the Troy EP and suspended because the claimant went back to work. Now you just have a possibly a notice of decision from the board directing that reimbursement to the employer. So you can file the Troy PY in that case, and as she pointed out, that would also avoid you being re-monitored for that same suspension again, and potentially having to go through an objection process that is not necessary. We have a couple more questions, so we're just going to put you on mute quick again and look at the new questions that came in. Next question is regarding Schroy that's rejected regarding agreement to compensate code if ANCR, ODNCR had been established. The agreement to compensate code must be with liability. Does a Schroy 02 need to be filed prior to resending the previously rejected Schroy MTC reporting the update to with liability? It would depend on the circumstance. If another Schroy MTC is due and there's no edit that prevents you from either population restriction or mandatory conditional edit that would prevent you from including that agreement to compensate code on that transaction, that's perfectly acceptable. And you would not have to do two separate transactions. Next question is for a carrier that handles Schroy SAs. If I have made a mistake on that, sometimes the Schroy 02s do not support or are difficult to file to correct their mistake regarding amounts. So in that case, in most instances, you could just submit another Schroy SA. And again, we don't have edits that will prevent you from doing it within 6 months. So you file the Schroy SA, you notice the amounts were incorrect. If there's a problem with getting the 02 submitted, the Schroy SA would likely submit in most scenarios. If you've left benefits off or other key pieces, that would be a different scenario and would require other transactions. If you ever struggling with that, do not hesitate to email the eClaims at wcb.ny.gov mailbox. They can always assist with the best course of action for those. There's a question regarding, can employers request to receive documents via email rather than hard copy, similar to TPAs? At this time, in the current older system we have, only self-insured employers. If you represent a self-insured employer who has a board-assigned W number, they can register for digital notices. That would be specific to their self-insured carrier mail and not their employer mail. As we build the new onboard system that the board is working on, we have heard quite a bit of feedback regarding employers and electronic notices. So that is definitely something we'll be looking at in the future. There's a question regarding seeing questions. They're just sent to panelists, so only panelists can see the questions. So that's why we do read them out during the webinar. We're just going to give it another minute just to see if we get any other questions.
Okay, that's going to conclude our questions and ultimately our webinar for today. If you wanted to submit any further questions after this presentation, or if for some reason it got submitted and we weren't able to answer it at this time, please send those questions to eClaims@wcb.ny.gov. And we also want to point you to the eClaims webpage, which can be found at wcb.ny.gov. And within that page, you'll see an overview that provides news, engagement opportunities, and an opportunity to register for email updates as well. And I highly recommend that as well. Go straight to your inbox for any updates or any news that you might be interested in regarding Workers' Compensation Board activities and issues. Also, as a reminder, if you have any penalty-related questions or measurements regarding monitoring, to please send those questions to monitoring@wcb.ny.gov. And as a final reminder, I'd like you to know that the board is also on social media. So we have a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also YouTube pages, and where we will post many videos for many of the different stakeholders. And so I behoove you to go to those channels and check them out, because we do provide a good source of information on those media presences as well. So with that, I just wanted to say a thank you, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.